it can be hard sometimes to go home. When Jesus went home to his hometown, the problem wasn't that the soul of the place was different. The problem was that the soul of the place was closed. The people would not see and hear and receive what Jesus had to say. And so they missed the blessing of his presence. So tonight, I want us to look at this text in Matthew 13, beginning in verse 53. And we're going to look at Jesus going home again. Begin in verse 53, Matthew 13. And when Jesus had finished these parables, he went away from there. He's just done this long series of parables, many of which are on the kingdom in Matthew 13, either 7 or 8, depending on how you count them. He went away from there, and coming to his hometown, which would be Nazareth, he taught them in their synagogue, so that they were astonished and said, "Where did this man get this wisdom and these mighty works? Is not this the carpenter's son? Is not his mother called Mary? And are not his brothers James and Joseph and Simon and Judas? Are not all his sisters with us? Where then did this man get all these things?" And they took offense at him. Now, in that time, when the synagogues were there in that area 2,000 years ago, any Jewish man could be asked or allowed to speak, stand up and speak. So it's not unusual that Jesus stood up and spoke in his synagogue, but what he said and the way he said it clearly was unusual. There were two things that struck the audience and offended them. First of all, Jesus spoke with a kind of authority they had never heard. Earlier in Matthew 7, we read this, verse 28 of Matthew 7. When Jesus finished these sayings, the crowds were astonished at his teaching, for he was teaching them as one who had authority, and not as their scribes. Meaning the teaching and preaching of Jesus was not a kind of verbal fog. It wasn't a rhetorical game. He wasn't trying to impress them or get them to think that he was somehow above them. It just came with a kind of authority that they had never encountered before. You ever encountered this? Have you ever heard a preacher and everything sounded right, but everything felt wrong with the preacher? You almost kind of doubted his sincerity. My brothers and I, and our wives, Ronnie and I, more so than my brothers, Ronnie and I have been to a lot of convention meetings over the years. And you hear some amazing stuff at conventions, but I was once sitting with one of my brothers, and a guy preached a sermon, and when he finished from the platform, there's like 8,000 people there. My brother looked at me and he said, "That was a convention sermon." And I knew exactly what he meant. It was a little too polished, which means that the guy had preached it numerous times before, and he made a plug for his book on the book table at the end of it. I would like you to accept Jesus, but I really want you to pay $19.95 for that book. That's a convention sermon. It's not that technically it's wrong. It's just that the spirit of it's wrong. When they were marveled at Jesus' authority, it was because there was a kind of purity about it. He spoke with an earnestness that was shocking to people. Also, the content of what Jesus said shocked people. The wisdom that he exhibited. For instance, in Luke 2, do you remember when Jesus was a boy? One of the few scenes of Jesus as a boy, and he goes missing from the caravan. They go back to Jerusalem. They find him in the temple, and in Luke 2:46, we read this. After 3 days, they found him in the temple, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. And all who heard him were amazed at his understanding and his answers. He was wise, and he had authority. Now, what particularly offends the citizens of his hometown of Nazareth is that the wisdom and authority of his speech did not make sense with what they thought they knew about him. So listen to their protest. Coming to his hometown in verse 54 of Matthew 13, He taught them in their synagogues so that they were astonished and said, "Where did this man get this wisdom and these mighty works? Is not this the carpenter's son?" Now here the reference is to Joseph. Joseph was a carpenter. By the way, the word for carpenter is the Greek word tekton. It just meant someone who worked with wood and or stone. So it's probably a little more nuanced than what we think of as a carpenter. Jesus didn't just go around, building shelves for people. It would have been possibly even a stonemason, would have been considered a carpenter. But they're amazed at this because he is the son of the carpenter. Now, in Matthew 13, they say, "Is this not the carpenter's son?" But in Mark's version, Mark 6:3, they say of Jesus, "Is not this the carpenter, the son of Mary?" So this is why traditionally it's thought that Joseph was a carpenter, and as would have been very common in that day, he passed the trade on to his son, Jesus. "Is not this the carpenter's son? Is not his mother called Mary? And are not his brothers James and Joseph and Simon and Judas?" Meaning they know the boys. These are Jesus's half-brothers. In traditional Roman Catholic teaching, it is denied that Jesus had brothers or sisters because of the doctrine of what's called the perpetual virginity of Mary. In traditional Catholic teaching, it is very important that Mary be ever virgin. That's the title. Mary ever virgin. Mary Theotokos, Mary Mother of God, Mary ever virgin. This took, and I won't divulge into this further, but I will just say theologians of a certain era, Catholic theologians of a certain area, went to really strange and creepy arguments to try to prove that Mary's virginity was restored after the birth of Jesus in a normal way. Like you read some of these things from a few hundred years ago and you think, what were these guys doing? It's a little much. The fact of the matter is this. I don't just say this as a Baptist Christian. I just say this and challenge you to look for yourself. The plain, simple reading of the Gospels is that Mary was a virgin. The Holy Spirit came upon her. She was found to be with child. She gave birth to Jesus. And then Mary and Joseph had a normal marriage relationship, and she had more children, brothers, and the Gospels elsewhere will speak of sisters. So these were, in fact, his brothers and his sisters. So what they're saying is, we know this guy. His dad's a carpenter. His mother's named Mary. We see her at the grocery store. We know his brothers. And then here is the reference to sisters, actually verse 56. "Are not all of his sisters with us?" In typical gospel fashions, it names all the brothers, but not the sisters. From the times, that would have been fairly common. "Where then did this man get all these things?" And they took offense at him. Now, the word offense technically means lack of belief. It's not this that they found what he said shocking. They did not believe him. That word offense, the Greek word there, and that little phrase took offense, is used 16 times in Matthew. It's only used 28 times in all four Gospels, which means that its usages in Matthew are more than the other three Gospel usages of the term combined. Matthew is constantly talking about people being offended. Now, in Mark's version, there's a little nuance. In Matthew 13, our version, it refers to him in verse 55 as the carpenter's son. That was the traditional way of saying it. It was a patriarchal society, so you would refer to someone's father, right? When I grew up in my hometown, my whole life, I promise you I could go back there right now and well, most of these guys would be too old probably, but as a kid growing up, the constant question I was constantly asked was, "Are you Rosie's grandson? Are you Rosie's grandson?" My granddad's nickname was Rosie. And some of you went through this too. Did you ever grow up in a town, everyone knew your parents or your mom or your dad or your granddaddy or your grand. Yeah. And so your whole life, you're asked that. This is Joseph's boy. But listen to how Mark puts it. Same episode, unless you want to argue that there are numerous homegoings. I do not. I think it's the same scene told from different angles. Mark 6:3, is not this the carpenter, the son of Mary, and brother of James and Joseph and Judas and Simon, and are not his sisters with us? And they took offense at him. Clearly the same scene. Matthew, the question is not this the carpenter's son? They reference his father, not by name, but everyone would have known it was Joseph. Mark, is not this the son of Mary? Is not this the carpenter, the son of Mary? Mark's version carries a loaded insult and an insinuation, because you did not traditionally refer in that time and place to a young man by his mother's name. The accusation being, we don't know who his father is because we've heard the rumors. That's an insult. If you were to say, they don't even mention his father, because that's the town gossip. They knew there was something weird about that birth. So they take offense. Look at this. Their offense is with the idea that someone who looked so common could possibly be anything but common. That a carpenter, a hometown boy who disappeared, and they all heard weird stories coming back, would then show up and sound like this. There is a kind of tyranny in hometowns at times when people resent you bettering yourself. You know what I mean? You ever gone back home and had family members say, well, who do you think you're better than us? Anyone ever experienced that? Well, Jesus did nothing to try to make himself look better. He just was who he was. But he comes back, and this is a shock to the system. Now, what's interesting is throughout Christian history, the same problem has happened. The church and the world have really struggled to understand how Jesus could be fully God and fully man. How can that be? That is the orthodox biblical teaching. He is fully man. He was born and had skin and toes and fingers, and he ate food. He took naps, maybe, but he definitely slept at night, right? He got colds. He put blankets around himself when it was cold at night. Jesus was fully human. Just to make you uncomfortable, let me just let that hang there for just a second. Jesus was fully human. He really was. Fully human. And fully God. That means he was God and man. That is unbelievable. How can that be? So throughout Christian history, there have been two persistent heresies that have cropped up periodically under different names. The first is Docetism. Docetism was the heretical belief early in the church's history. In fact, it's reflected even in John's epistles. John, who wrote 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, seems to be writing against the Docetists. Docetist, Docetist. Docetism was the heretical belief that Jesus appeared to be human, but he really wasn't. It stresses the divinity over the humanity. So Jesus had a body, but really, he kind of floated off the ground a little. You know what I mean? If you were to say to a Docetist, which not to get too much into the weeds on this, but which is connected to Gnosticism. Gnosticism was an ancient heresy that believed that material matter was inherently evil, and therefore the job was to cast off the material. So you can see how Docetism was connected to Gnosticism. Docetism arose out of the belief that God could not truly have a body because bodies are evil. By the way, the Bible does not teach that bodies are evil and that material creation is evil, does it? It teaches that we're fallen. But being fallen, when God made Adam and Eve, he said, it's good. You having a body is not a bad thing. You were made to have one. This is why Christianity teaches the resurrection from the dead. Ronnie and I were talking about this last week. She said, what will our resurrected bodies be like? And I said, mine will be different than this. That's all I know. But Docetism was one error. And the problem with Docetism is that it guts the cross of meaning. Because on the cross, Jesus did not really die. If he was not really flesh, his body did not die. So that's one error. On the other extreme is something called Ebionism. The Ebionites, Ebionite, the Ebionites took the different approach. They overstressed the humanity and downplayed the divinity. So Docetism downplays the divinity, downplays the humanity, who wasn't really flesh, and upplays the divinity. He was God with a phantom body. Ebionism upplays the divinity or upplays the fleshliness and downplays divinity. He was more human than God. And so I just want to say that this scandal in Nazareth has worked itself out in Christian history in these ways. People have always struggled to understand this, that he could be Jesus from Nazareth, the carpenter who was good with wood and stone, who had a favorite place he liked to eat, who had a favorite meal, who liked to sit under that tree up there, who was good at whittling, I don't know, whatever. I mean, he did things that human beings do, who had brothers. Did Jesus, if you were to say, did Jesus ever playfully wrestle with his brothers as a boy? A Docetist would say absolutely not. But of course he wrestled with his brothers as a boy, because boys wrestle, right? Did Jesus play tag? Did Jesus go fishing? Did Jesus, yeah, of course, fully man, but fully God. The first point that I'm making here is that the incarnation is flabbergasted. And people have always struggled with it. But I want to challenge you, hold to these two things. Do not downplay his humanity. If Jesus walked 20 miles in a day, did his feet get sore? Yeah, of course. If Jesus walked through a field, is it possible that it irritated him and he sneezed? Yeah, but think about this. Why do the movies never show Jesus sneezing? I would argue that American film depictions of Jesus are inherently docetistic. They downplay humanity so as not to offend pious sensibilities. You never see Jesus in one of the movies on the Sermon on the Mount saying something like this. This would be a quote. I want to see this in a movie. I want to see Jesus say, blessed are the peacemakers. Excuse me. Excuse me. There's a gnat. Peter. Peter comes over, water, drinks water. Starts talking to him. Sorry, my eyes are watering now. Blessed are the peacemakers. Now, I ask you, is that disrespectful to propose that might have happened? No, because that's what people with bodies do. Jesus had a body, but Jesus was fully God. In the movies, Jesus never stutters, ever. And it's always a kind of weird amalgam British accent, American accent. His hair is almost never out of place. You never see Jesus combing his hair. Hold to the full humanity and deity of Christ. The second point I want to make is this: the refusal to believe shuts a door on many mighty works of God. So they don't believe him. Look at verse 57. They took offense at him, which I've already said means they did not believe. But Jesus said to them, a prophet is not without honor except in his hometown and in his own household. You have to think about that because it's a double negative. You ever thought about that? Is not without honor. That means he has honor, except in his hometown. I remember going home one of the times, Ronnie, right after we had gone to seminary in Texas, and going back to my hometown and encountering a girl that I went to high school with. And she said, "What are you doing now?" I said, "I'm in seminary. I'm going to be a pastor." And she said, "You're kidding." I said, "What does that mean?" She said, "Oh, nothing. It's hard to go home again. It can be hard to go home again if you're like me, by which I mean an idiot. I wasn't bad at home, but I was real foolish. Just lots of nonsense. Most of it my brother's fault. It's hard to go home again." They don't believe, but here's the tragedy of it. Jesus isn't making light of it like I am. What Jesus is saying is, it's a great tragedy when God is so close to you that you cannot see him. I mean, he's right here. Because you can't fathom that God would walk back into your hometown and preach a sermon. That's shocking. But then the most tragic sentence, and one of the saddest sentences in the Bible, verse 58. "And he did not do many mighty works there because of their unbelief." He did not do many mighty works there. And some of the other gospel accounts are more definitive. He did no miracles there. Matthew's account actually softens it a little bit and makes it sound like he did some things, but not many. He did not do many mighty works there because of their unbelief. Mark 6, he could do no mighty work there except that he laid hands on a few sick people and healed them. I love that. They just healed some people miraculously of their problems. That is a powerfully pitiful verse. To be that close to the source of all life and healing. You know, there were some guys dismissing him who needed a healing touch from him. You know what I mean? Probably sitting in that synagogue was some guy with a crooked back who could have been healed, and he didn't. He mocked him. I think sometimes we miss the things that are right in front of our faces, and this is a story of that. I want to share with you something Frederick Dale Bruner wrote. He said this. He said, this story, the text we just read, this story teaches us to weigh realities. It teaches that Jesus is not less messianic for being human, nor is he less divine for coming from ordinary stock. And then he says this, it is the glory of God to stoop. It is the glory of God to stoop, to reach down into the common things of life and to love us where we are. Jesus goes back to his hometown and they miss it. They miss him because they will not believe. Don't do that. Jesus draws near. Open your heart to receive his presence.